Welcome to the All Out Leadership Podcast, hosted by Pastor Eric Lawson, where each episode is uniquely designed to help you live all out by bringing you practical leadership from a biblical perspective delivered in 10 minutes or less. So whether you're a business leader, serving in ministry, or simply looking to grow in your leadership, this podcast is for you. Before we dive into this week's topic, make sure to subscribe to the podcast and download the show notes at ericlawson.com/podcast. And while you're at it, feel free to share the content on social media. Now, let's join Pastor Eric for this week's conversation.
Welcome as we continue another edition of the All Out Leadership Podcast. We are on excellence. Today I want to read from the story of King Solomon. King Solomon, 1 Kings chapter 10, verse 1. Now when the queen of Sheba heard the fame of Solomon concerning the name of the Lord, she came to test him with hard questions. Look, Jesus said, if I be lifted up from the earth, I'll draw all men unto me. A church that's lifting up the name of Jesus, that's making sure it's Jesus that's famous, not the pastor, not a personality, not a program, but Jesus. He's attractional, and people are going to come to hear and see this Jesus that's moving inside of a church. And people are going to come and they're going to test us, and they're going to bring some hard questions, some hard problems as they come. Now, Queen of Sheba traveled about 1,500 miles to get to hear Solomon. Now, think about that. That's a long ways. It wasn't she jumped on an airplane and flew first class. She didn't drive in a limo. She had to be on some type of caravan, 1,500 miles. This would have taken months to get to this location. Now, she was coming from either modern day Yemen or most likely Ethiopia, and she wanted to see for herself that if this excellence that Solomon had was true. So she came to test him, just as people will come to test your business, your company. They've heard good things. They're going to give you a test drive, so to speak, to see if what they heard is true. And people come through the doors of our church to test us as well. 1 Kings chapter 10, verse 2. So she, the queen of Sheba, came with a very large entourage of camels that bore spices and very much gold and precious stones. And when she came to Solomon, she spoke with him about all that was in her heart. And then we see that in verse 3, so Solomon answered all her questions. There was nothing so difficult for the king that he could not explain to her. I find it important that Solomon answered the questions she was actually asking. Too often, businesses are trying to answer questions that the customer actually doesn't have. Look, when you're selling a product, make sure it's answering the actual question and the problem that they actually have. So often we're trying to sell features that actually don't matter and answer any questions. So churches do this all the time. They're deep, we're going really deep, but you're not answering any questions that everyday people actually have. But Jesus did, and that's why he was so attractional. And too often today, the church is like pulling up to somebody on the side of the road who's has a flat tire, and they go, hey, I can help, and they pull out jumper cables. Well, that's not relevant, and it doesn't answer to the need that the people have. What they need is help with their flat tire. Look, quit giving jumper cables to people with flat tires. So we should be as church, we should be as staff that are prepared to answer the questions that people actually have. It's part of why the way we teach and our format and how visual we are and the way we design and structure our messages and our series is designed to answer questions that people are asking. So we see in the verse 4, and when the queen of Sheba had seen all the wisdom of Solomon, the house he had built, the food on his table, the seating of his servants, the services of waiters, their apparel, his cups, the entryway by which he went up into the house of the Lord, there was no more spirit in her. Another translation says her breath was taken away, or she was breathless. Happy are your men, and happy are these servants of yours who stand continually before you and hear your wisdom. It's important to see that excellence could be felt all throughout the ministry of King Solomon. And history records that she became a believer, that she went back and impacted her nation. In fact, Jesus even commended her and said she will rise up at the last days and condemn this generation because she believed and heard the wisdom of Solomon. So I believe that she's in heaven. And what was it? It was the excellence in Solomon's ministry that took her breath or her excuses away from becoming a believer in Yahweh, the God of Israel. So I want to remind you that it all wasn't spiritual things that convinced her. The house was one. What's that? The facilities. They were clean. They were well kept. They were manicured. The food, what was that? It was all about the hospitality and the quality of what was set before. The seating of the servants, that's organizational. It was organized. It wasn't chaotic. The service of the waiters, what's that? That's customer service, just the attitude and how they carried themselves. Their appearance, look, they dressed for success, so to speak. They dressed appropriately for the context that they were serving in. They were well-groomed and taken care of. The cupbearer, that refers to the leadership. Cupbearer was always a loyal advisor to the king. And so just the leaders that Solomon had surrounded himself and the wisdom and how they carried themselves. The entryway, which is their walk and their worship. She saw their walk, she saw their worship, and she saw that they were happy. And all these things took her breath away. So as you could see, that it's not just one thing, it's the accumulation of all these little things, these little details done just a little bit better that ultimately take people's breath away.
Thank you for joining us on the All Out Leadership Podcast. We hope you gained new biblical insight that challenged you to grow in your leadership. If you've enjoyed this week's episode, we would love your help in getting the content out farther. You can help by subscribing to the podcast at ericlawson.com/podcast and telling others about it. Next week, Pastor Eric will be back with another episode. So until then, we hope you have a great week being an all-out leader.